Have you tried creating a realistic laser beam? Are you interested in learning some more about the particle system and force field effects in Blender? If so, listen on. Derek from Blendertek here. I'm slowly taking Blendertek to the next level in professionalism. I've been playing around with a new intro where a couple of robot arms laser cut letters into a plane which then falls out, revealing the words. In doing so, I realized that a single regular particle system wasn't going to get the full effect that I needed. I realized I would need two at the very least, one for the laser and one for the sparks. Now sparks I've mastered well if you've seen my sparks test clip. However, if you saw the test clip I posted yesterday of my first attempt, it really didn't have a good look at all when it came to the particle system. So I've done some testing and come up with a technique to create as realistic looking of a laser beam as possible. And so I'm now going to share what I've learned to come up with this. This is completely a creation of my own through trial and error, and while there may be people doing similar things, this is definitely unique because I started from scratch with a blank canvas. So let's do that and get a nice looking laser beam quick. If the following video helps you in any way or you enjoy it, consider liking it as well as consider subscribing for more Blender, Unity 3D, coding, and all sorts of other related videos. And also don't forget our team's motto, create your way. The first thing that we're going to need is a mesh that emits particles, obviously. I found that creating a polygon, then removing all vertexes except one with the origin point being at the exact same spot gets you the best results. Let's do that first. So I'm just going to hide the camera for now, and I'm going to delete the stock lamp and the stock cube. Next, I'm going to add a circle. Now, using the operator panel or the F6 floating operator panel, I'm going to fill it with a triangle fan. So now when we tab into edit mode, all we have to do is delete every single vertex except the center one. So we're now left with a single vertex, as you can see here, the tiny little orange dot, which is at the origin point, which is the larger orange dot. This is where all of our particles are going to be emitted from. Let's call our circle laser emitter, laser beam emitter, and then let's simply just add a particle system and let's call it laser. We'll get on to the rest of the settings after we set up the rest of our scene. Next, let's create an object which I'll call laser. That will be our laser beam. The transform properties nor the layer matters, however the material does. So let's tab out of edit mode and let's create a mesh cylinder. So again, it doesn't matter what size it is. However, like I said, the material does. So let's create a new material. And as I said, I'm going to call this laser, or I suppose you could call it beam because it's going to be what the actual beam is made from. So all our laser beam material is going to consist of is an emission shader to emit light. And it's going to be in the color of our choice. In this case, I'll choose Blendertek blue. If we want, we can drag and drop the color into the viewport color so we can see it like that. And also the layer doesn't matter, so I'm going to move this to layer 2. However, until we get everything set up, I'm going to shift click on layer 2 down here so that we can see everything at once. I'm also just going to move it out of the way of our laser beam emitter by grabbing it along the x-axis so it's out of its way. So we have our laser beam emitter with a particle system, and we have our cylinder here, which is our actual laser beam with a emission material. On to the next step. Before doing so, however, I wanted to tell you that I've tried a bunch of different shapes for the actual beam, and I found that the cylinder works the best. However, you're definitely free to experiment. So the next step is we need to turn off gravity in the scene tab. So we're going to check off gravity. This way the particle system is only affected by a force field, which we're going to create next. Something to note, however, if you do require gravity in the rest of your scene, then simply leave gravity on for now and then turn the gravity setting to 0 in the particle system fields weight tab, which is this one right here. Under field weights, you would just turn gravity down to 0. That would get you the exact same result. However, that would require extra physics calculation, and so the bake would take slightly longer. So for this example, I'm simply just going to turn off gravity in our scene data. Doing the other method by just turning gravity off in the fields weight tab allows you to decide how much gravity will affect each particle system. For example, my sparks I would want to be affected by gravity. However, a laser beam is not affected by gravity. So I would obviously use the field weights method. But again, in this example, I'm just going to disable it here. So lastly, since we have no gravity, we need something to affect the particle's movement. I found that the wind force field effector is the most desirable because it's user-friendly and easy to tweak and complements a particle system well. So we're going to create that by hitting Shift A as usual, going to force field and then wind, and it creates this little row of circles with an arrow pointing up. So we need to rotate it around the y-axis 90 degrees, I suppose negative 90 in our case, so that the arrow is pointing in the direction that we want our laser beam to shoot out, I guess, if you will. I'm also going to take it and move it back a little bit. So I'm just going to grab it along the x-axis. It's fairly important, or quite important, to have your wind force field center point in alignment with the origin and the vertex of our laser beam emitter mesh. Also, under the wind force field, I'm going to rename it wind. Under the physics tab, the strength of 1, which I believe is in meters per second, is quite low. So I'm going to turn that up to something like 250. You'll see that these circles go a lot further out. This will have a dramatic effect and create what we want. We also want to uncheck rotation because we don't want our particles to rotate. We want them to just go straight. So that is really all that we need to adjust here, as long as you have rotation unchecked and strength turned up. Next, let's set up our actual particle system to start getting a laser beam generated. So we're going to select our laser beam emitter, this little tiny thing down here, and we'll go to the particle system tab, the one with the little stars, which we've called laser in this case, and we're going to start setting up our settings. This is where all the magic happens, and it gets slightly complicated, but it is actually quite easy overall since we don't have to worry about physics. The first thing we need to do is crank up the number of particles emitted to, say, 25,000. This may seem high, but trust me, it's really not high at all, especially considering the way we're using it. The start frame is fine, the end frame is your choice. I'm going to leave it at the stock 200. Randomness, we definitely want to be 0. We want no randomness to our particles. However, lifetime has a major effect on the style of your beam. A very low lifetime, like 1 or 2 frames, is going to make it almost as if there were laser pulses shot. However, a longer lifetime, the full 200 frames, which I'm going to set it to, will give us the actual beam effect. So that has a major effect on the look of your beam. Next, we want to change emit from faces to emit from verts. And since we only have one vert, it will only emit from the single vert, obviously. The reason for this is because otherwise it's going to shoot our cylinders off in kind of random directions, and it doesn't make our laser beam look realistic. And we want to uncheck random just so that Blender has no randomness at all to where it's emitting from. That should be all that we need there. The cache doesn't matter yet. We can leave that alone. The velocity, the emitter geometry normal. Usually this is how you would you would get your particles moving. I believe I turned that to 0 since we're going to use the wind to move. We don't want our actual particle system to have any or much physics. Again, make sure there's no randomness. We don't want any rotation, so make sure that's turned off. Under physics, we do want Newtonian turned on, otherwise it just won't work properly at all. However, the mask can have an effect on the look. I'm going to leave it at stock for now. My test scene that I had set up for all my settings crashed on me when I tried to create children particles, so I'm just going off memory now. The rest, I believe, we can leave alone for now. So next, we need to choose how it's actually going to render our particles. So one thing that I was playing with is line, which gives you, if I zoom in here, we'll see if we can see it at all. No. But basically it gives you similar to the effect I was looking for, but I couldn't get it to work right. Possibly you could. However, we're just going to use an object, and our object to be duplicated for each particle is obviously going to be our beam, the cylinder that we chose a color of, which has an emission material. Back to the particle system. The scale we can definitely leave checked off. However, rotation and global, definitely uncheck those. Size here, make sure random is 0, but size and physics, you'll see they both do the exact same thing, so we'll leave them at stock for now. Under display, we can leave it just the way it is, and children, you probably don't want to turn on. I found that crashed Blender. And again, field weights, if you didn't uncheck gravity under the scene data tab, then you would want gravity as 0 here. Since I've turned it off, it doesn't really matter what choice I choose here. Now it appears that it hasn't worked the same way as original. I just get a single emission of one particle. So I am going to do what I did the first time and see if that fixes it. So what I want to do is delete our laser beam emitter completely. I'm going to add a new mesh circle. I'm going to rotate it around the Y 90 degrees again. And what I did last time actually is I didn't have a fill. I just deleted everything except for one vertex, and I selected it and I moved it to the center of the where the origin is. So selection to cursor, so right in the middle. Let's see if that works as intended now. So we'll reset up our particle system, make sure it's actually emitting particles. There we go, we have a beam of particles shooting out. So again, we'll ramp it up to 25,000. Our lifetime, the full 200 frames. Again, at any time, as long as you go back to frame 0, you can then kind of test it without having to bake it. So you can see we now have a very heavy stream of particles. Perfect. I don't know why it wasn't working before with my single vertex. We will call this laser again. When I emit from verts, we don't want any randomness. Rotation, none. Velocity, none. Alright, physics the same as before. The render we want to change to our beam object, so it's now rendering out the cylinder in massive amounts, as you can see here. However, it is rotated wrong. So how do we fix that? It just occurred to me we actually do need rotation. We need rotation, the initial orientation, to be normal. And that'll be the normal of the face, or in our case the vert. So you can see we now have essentially a laser beam. If we set our camera up something like this so that we can see it all the way to the end, that should work out well. And we will unhide our beam object by unchecking layer 2. We're just on layer 1 now. Let's move everything to layer 1. Make sure everything's still working. Yep. Move our object. We want to move our beam to layer 2 so that it doesn't get rendered at all. Make sure everything's still working. Perfect. Go into camera view, go into rendered view, turn on bordered. Oh, it's already checked off. Perfect. And as you can see, we have essentially a laser beam. Now you'll see that the first few frames, it just starts off like that, but after a few frames, then it reaches basically its endpoint. It does go on for infinity, essentially, depending on the speed of your wind. So you'll have to play with that setting, as well as the number of particles and the lifetime. However, this is quite a thick laser beam, so that's where I would go and turn the size down quite a bit to about 1/5 of the original size, so 0.01. Now we have, essentially a laser beam. If we quickly render this scene out, it'll be quite quick. You can see we have our vert emitting a laser beam. As simple as that. If I turn down the number to like 500 and the lifetime down to like 5 frames, then you'll notice that it creates little pulses almost. So for a full beam, that's why I leave the lifetime to the full size of our frames, but you can see how this is like a pulsed laser almost. So that's where you need to increase the number of particles till you get your full laser beam effect, which I found has to be quite high, at least 15,000 generally. As you can see, that creates more or less a continuous beam unless you're extremely zoomed in. Even then, you barely see the edges there. So at that point, I'll bake this now. You'll see it's a very quick bake because there's really no or little physics involved. You can see no matter how much we zoom in, there's enough particles that it's a completely straight beam all the way to the end. And this is only rendered at 10 samples too. So yeah, something like that is one way to create a laser beam like that. Now the only problem with this method is if you parent your emission beam vertex to an object, in this case just a cone, when we rotate the cone, the circle takes on the location, but it doesn't take on the rotation of it. Now if you want to have an object shoot out laser beams wherever it's pointed, what you'll need to do is obviously parent it to the object. However, you'll also need to parent the wind system to the object. So we'll parent that. Now wherever we rotate our laser beam generator, if you want to call it that now, is where the beam will get generated because it's coming out of the normal of the vert. So just like that. And that's a very important step to have to make that happen. Otherwise it'll still get shot out the original way. So having the wind force field parented to wherever the beam is coming out of is very important. In fact, I'm sure you could even parent it directly to each other, and then wherever one is facing, the other will go and it will get shot out that way. So that's just something to take note of. Now there is a secondary method that people used to use way back in the old Blender days. Let me just save this quickly. What they did was they used a spotlight with a very narrow angle. So we will take this light and we will turn it into a spotlight and we will point it directly at this cube, like so. And so what people would do is they would obviously choose the color that they wanted. We'll take green in this case, and they would turn the size of the cone down to a very narrow size. So now what you get is basically just a light. Now there's ways to get more of a beam look, but this is what people did for more of a laser pointer look, and it definitely works. It's just it doesn't give you the beam look. As far as I know, you can't really do that with a lamp. Maybe perhaps if you had some sort of volume rendering, or some sort of way to scatter the light in some way. So yeah, this is a way to get a laser pointer look, is just to create a spotlight with a very, very narrow cone angle. However, yeah, you'll definitely need a particle system to get the actual beam. So anyways, I hope that you learned something from this. I hope that it taught you a bit more about particle systems, about force fields, and just a little bit more about Blender in general. So anyways, thanks for watching from the team here at Blendertek.com. Also, any input on the new intro idea, definitely let me know. It's going to be a couple of robot arms, like I said, that are cutting out the words Blendertek out of a plate of steel with a laser beam that will leave sparks flying and smoke, and then the plate that's cut out will fall over, and hopefully I can have the steel kind of glowing. So let me know if you think that's a cool idea or not. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video and learned something, consider liking it and consider subscribing for more videos. We're on Twitter at twitter.com/blender_tech and Facebook at facebook.com/blendertekpage, all one word. If you dislike this video for some reason, don't just hit the thumbs down button and leave. Instead, please leave a comment or email us at info@blendertek.com about what you did not like, so that we can continually improve our videos based on your community input. We also take requests and call for help, so if you have a problem, we will try to help you answer it with videos or emails and pictures. And if you want to see a tutorial, just let us know and we'll put it on our list, and if time permits, you will see it get put up. See you guys next time, and remember, create your way.